So, I've been a YouTuber, and since I got enough views, I can monetize my channel. But when you monetize it, they have a checklist, and I don't want to engage in any kind of hate speech, because we should love everybody. The Bible says we should love even our enemies, and we should think of other people better than ourselves and walk in humility. I mean, God loved the world. The Bible says that He sent Christ to die for us, to provide a way of salvation while we were yet sinners. So we need to have love, mercy, and compassion. But we also need to have dialogue and debate and be able to express our opinions and search for truth and be critical and passionate about things, have dialogue and debate. And there's an issue when you're looking at this list. It says, are you engaging in speech against any marginalized or oppressed people? And of course I wouldn't want to do that, but what they're doing is they're looking on Muslims as a marginalized people, as an aggrieved people. And I want to say that I don't believe that Muslims are an aggrieved people. And we're going to look at why. I mean, on what basis would you say that Muslims are an aggrieved people? And when we talk about, Muhammad or the Quran, what the Quran says versus what the Bible says, first off, you need to realize that we have Muslim apologists, like go to Speaker's Corner, and they'll attack the doctrine of the Trinity. They'll attack the atonement, that Jesus died on the cross. The Quran seems to contradict that. So these Muslim missionaries will attack core Christian beliefs and ridicule them. So these are the beliefs that we hold most dear as Christians. So it seems like we should have the right to answer when they mock and ridicule and try to attack and tear down what the Bible says, the credibility of the Bible, the church. We should be able to respond. What they'll do is, if you try to respond to some of these railing accusations they make, they'll say, well, you're oppressing an aggrieved people. But there's no basis on Muslims being aggrieved people. I'll look at 10 points and a bonus point to show why Muslims are not an aggrieved people. Number one, Islam is the second largest religion in the world, and some people think that eventually, I don't think this is going to happen, but some people believe that eventually Islam could become the largest religion in the world, with certain projections of the future. So, how could, there's a lot of Hindus, there's a lot of Buddhists. How come Buddhists and Hindus aren't viewed as an aggrieved people, or as a marginalized, oppressed people, as much as Muslims are? Why do Muslims have this special status? So if I got in a debate about Buddhism, or why things I like about Buddhism, things I don't like about Buddhism, things I don't like about the Buddha, that'd probably be protected speech, right? But if I make the same questions about Islam, then you're considered an Islamophobe and engaging in hate speech. So it's a large religion, and there's almost 2 billion adherents to Islam around the world. And Muslims use the power of their numbers, and that's not something they've just started doing. If you look at India, Gandhi was leading independence for India, and Pakistan broke off because it's like, well, we have numbers here and we're not Hindu, we're different. And so they used the power of their numbers to break off. And the same thing in Lebanon. We had this Lebanese civil war where you had a precarious balance between these different groups, Sunnis and Shias and Christians. And then the demographics changed, and the Muslims began a civil war because they wanted to dominate, since there were 5% or so less Christians than they had been 20, 30 years earlier. So Muslims have numbers, and they use the power of numbers, and they haven't just started using the power of numbers. They've used the power of numbers throughout history, especially in the 20th century. Point number one, Islam is the second largest religion in the world, and people believe it's going to become, eventually, the dominant religion in the world. That's unlikely, but that's what some people believe looking at demographic data. Number two, Muslims control 20%, if not more, of the surface of planet Earth. It's like, how can you be a marginalized, oppressed people when probably 25% or more, maybe as high as 30% of the surface of the world is controlled by these people? And you have more than 50 Muslim majority countries that in many of these countries, they're almost, they have less than 1% of other religious groups. So that, they dominate. That's like how many countries in the world? Roughly 195. So about 1/4 of all nations in the world are Islamic. How is that a marginalized, oppressed people? They're very strong in controlling in numbers of people around the world, in numbers of country they control, and they use that power. In the United Nations, you have an Islamic bloc. They vote together and they can make their agenda known. Number 3, the most wealthy and powerful countries in the world are Islamic. Let's look at Saudi Arabia. You have a population of 35 million, and they have like almost $1 trillion in gross domestic product in a year. And I was reading this book, I think it's Joel Richardson, his book on Babylon, and he was talking about one of these Saudi Arabian princes going to a casino in Monaco in I think it's the 70s or 80s, and blowing the equivalent of $30 million in one night on gambling, drugs, alcohol, and women. So, and the amount of money they spend, like if you look at Indonesia today, it's the largest Muslim countries, and maybe 40 years ago, they were moderate Muslims, and people say, well, it's just folk Islam, it's not hardcore Salafi Islam. Now it is, because Saudi Arabia went over there and indoctrinated all these people in extremist Islam, because they spend more money in a month in proselytizing, evangelism, and missionary work for Islam than probably all the Christian churches, the Catholic, Protestant, everybody. How much money they spend on missionaries an entire year. Muslims spend that much per month, and that's why a moderate country like Indonesia was transformed in 40 years from a moderate country to a hotbed of extremism. So that shows their power and the power of their money. So not only did they cause these, I remember I knew somebody that was deployed to Bosnia, and they had all these people from Saudi Arabia. It's amazing. They didn't have roads or infrastructure, but they had billion-dollar Golden Dome mosques, and they had terrorists teaching these madrasas, and imams were all like Al-Qaeda preachers financed by Saudi Arabia. So, like I said, Albania and Kosovo don't have roads, but they have a lot of influence of terrorism and giant multi-billion-dollar mosques. So they control and influence foreign policy. That's why we're in Bosnia in the first place. In South Sudan, 3 million non-Muslims were massacred during the 90s, and America didn't bat an eye. And yet we sent our troops to Somalia. Why? Because Saudi Arabia wants to go in there to help their fellow Muslims. They won't send their own military in there, so they use ours. And what happened? Well, our soldiers were killed, and our dead bodies or stripped naked and dragged through the streets. And then we had pirates attacking and killing us after that in Somalia. So Yugoslavia, Yugoslavia is coming apart, and Bosnia was 1/3 Muslim, 1/3 Serbian Orthodox, 1/3 Croatian Catholic. And they had a civil war, and it was none of our business, but Saudi Arabia wanted us to be our business, and so the news media. So we went over there and made sure that we had a government over there dominated by Islam. So it just shows the influence and power of Saudi Arabia, how they control things behind the scenes. They've sent our countries in the past to serve, to fight in their wars, to die for their causes. So this isn't people that are operating out of weakness or marginalization. This is people operating out of strength. Of course, there's limits. They went too far. Bin Laden did, and we have an international war on terrorism. We're fighting that war with one arm tied behind our back. Number 4, Islam has been, in the past, imperialistic and colonizer, and it still honors the legacy of imperialism. They're not ashamed of it. They're proud of their empire. You have the Umayyad Empire, the Abbasid Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Timurid Empire. We had this crazy man named Tamerlane who killed off 5% of the global population in an Islamic empire in Central Asia. You also had the Ottoman Empire, where the Turks colonized their fellow Muslims and colonized all the Arab nations. And Lawrence Arabia A British agent mobilized the aggrieved, persecuted Arabs to fight against their Ottoman Turk overlords at that time. 5, you have racism and exploitation of minorities in the Muslim world throughout their history and today. Black Africans are called ebed. I think that's how you say it, meaning slave. It's an equivalent of the N-word used in Arabic, and it's the common word for a black person. Very demeaning and racist, and they often make racist comments about black people and treat them that way. And throughout history, you have jizya, or Christians. It's like, how did North Africa? We had these great theologians like Tertullian and Augustine. Now Christians, there are hardly any Christians in North Africa, except in Egypt today. What happened? A lot of it was through the jizya. They would tax Christians, exploit them, extort them. And every 50 years, you'd have genocidal campaigns and massacres and pogroms. It's all recorded in history. People care to look at it. So North Africa was the people where they were Berbers, and now Berbers are still marginalized minority. They're the indigenous people, as are the Copts of Egypt. And after the Muslims came and took over Egypt, they oppressed the Coptic people so horrifically that the Coptic people revolted in the 700s and the 800s. Assyrian Christians, other non-Arab groups, non-Muslim groups are discriminated against in the Islamic world to this very day. And with racism, you have statements in the Quran and the Hadith about, especially the Hadith, Muhammad has milk white skin. He says that Satan looks like a black man. He ridicules black Africans and says they're raisin heads. So that's in their sacred text. 6 is genocide that's been carried out by Muslim nations throughout history. In India, how many Hindus were massacred by Muslims? I think a lower estimate is 10 million. Could you imagine that? It's probably 6 to 10. It could have been as high. Some people estimate as high as 80 million Hindus were killed by Muslims during all these invasions and colonization of India throughout history. So it's incredible. Well, why do they kill so many Hindus? Because they're idolaters, right? Even though they persecute Christians and Jews, if you pay the jizya and you submit to Islamic rule, then you're tolerated. You don't have equal status as a citizen. You're an outsider, poor and exploited and marginalized. But you still have some protections, and that's something that Hindus are not afforded as idolaters. So that's why we have such huge numbers of Hindus being subjected to genocide. The Ottoman Empire, they killed a lot of, committed genocide against Assyrian Christians, against Greek Orthodox Christians, and against Armenian Christians. Over 1 million were massacred and killed in various ways by the Ottoman Islamic Empire. ISIS, they carried out genocidal campaigns against the Yazidis and the Assyrian Christians and moderate Muslims. South Sudan, as I mentioned, 3 million African Christians killed by the Sudanese Islamic Republic government. Next, I want to mention slavery. They said slavery is of whites and blacks. There's this book called it's called Lost Worlds of Africa, which talks about the slave trade in European slaves that went on during the Middle Ages, where Muslims would go and raid Europe for slaves and bring them back to the Muslim world and sell them. And you had a Catholic order called the Trinitarian, which raised money. It's terrible. Raised money to pay the hostage fees, to ransom. Over the centuries, thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of white European Christians were enslaved. That affected the United States. We had an ISIS-like government in North Africa called the Barbary States, and one of the first wars that America had to fight was against, they called the Barbary Pirates, and that was a big issue for a long time. We got drawn into a war, and the Marines still sing about that in their official song. Slavery of blacks, over 1,400 years. I mentioned how we have these racist attitudes in Islamic culture towards blacks. West African slave trade, probably from the as soon as the Muslims arrived in that territory until today. We had slavery going on. East Africa. So over 1,400 years of enslaving black people. Muhammad himself bought, sold, and traded black Africans as slaves. And I was reading, this is incredible. There's a Saudi Arabian prince in England, and he killed his black African slave. And this was just like 10 years ago. We had a Saudi Arabia that had to flee the United States because he was holding women as sex slaves. And so they escaped, and they're going to file charges against him. He fled the country. After 9/11, Bush made sure that all the members of the Saudi Arabian royal family over here, the first plane that went out was to carry them so they wouldn't be held accountable for their crimes against our country. Bush, who takes money from these evil people, probably George H.W. Bush and George Bush Jr. So the first plane that went out was to make sure that the Saudi Arabian people who were behind the attack on 9/11 were able to escape the country and not be held accountable for their crimes. It's horrific. But like I said, I was watching this thing about this. It's in England, and this Saudi Arabian guy had a black slave, and he murdered him, and he was raping the man. It's this weird relationship. I guess the slave had like some kind of a Stockholm syndrome. It's very interesting to look at it's disturbing the psychological effects of enslavement on people. It's weird. But there's this movie called The Ghost in the Darkness about these man-eating lions. I think the late 1800s, England was trying to build a railroad. And someone was discussing this. It's like, what's it called, the Savo lions? Anyway, someone was speculating that how did these lions acquire, these two lions acquire the taste for human flesh? And he was saying, well, probably what happened was the Arabs were, they're bringing black African slaves. And if you got thirsty or hurt or tired, they just leave you out in the wilderness. And if you're sick, you just lay out there and get eaten by a lion. So these lions didn't have to go hunt for food. They just had to wait for the slave caravans to go through, and people fall down in exhaustion, and they'd have food. So they acquired this taste for human flesh by people that the Muslim slave traders were abandoning in their slave caravans. Anybody sick or weak, or passed out, dehydrated, you just throw them to the side, and the lions would eat them. So these lions acquired a taste for human flesh thanks to Muslim slave traders in East Africa. So I want to mention something else. I was reading about the Islamic slave trade, and this is really shocking and revolting. But what they would do, their male African slaves, they would castrate them, right? And they would cut the entire male organ off, testicles and the shaft and everything. And I guess they had a little hole they pee through. And that, of course, that's probably part of the reason why some of these people are dying from blood loss, because they're castrated when they were captured. And the ones that survived would be worked to death. You actually had a slave revolt, I think, in the 800s in Iraq, or was it the 700s? I forget exactly. But you'd have all these black people who were subjected to that in the early days of Islam, who revolted against their oppression and being enslaved and working in the fields. If you look at the history of Islam and the black man, I mean, there's a lot of Africans who are Muslim, and you got the African American Muslims as well. I don't understand why any black person would be a Muslim, honestly. I just don't. If you know the history, how could they be? But they are. So I had this book. It was entitled "The Strong Black God," about I think it was the history of the Niger River, and I believe that was the book that had the information about the slave trade, the Arab slave trade in black Africans. And it was mentioning how that the Muslims would castrate the black men by cutting off the entire male sexual organ, the scrotum and the penis, everything. And of course, many of these men would bleed to death. And if these men were bleeding to death, a lot of times they would just throw them aside so they'd be eaten by the lions. And that's why they think that these lions and the ghosts in the darkness acquired such a appetite for human flesh, because they started eating slaves that were abandoned by the Muslim slave traders in East Africa, but they had the same practices in West Africa, which is the book was about. So there was a picture in this book also of the British Empire decided to end the slave trade in Africa. And this is in the late 1800s. And I remember I was watching we're trying to protect our aquatic resources. So there's like I guess the UN, other organizations like, okay, you can fish here, you can't fish there. No whaling, no tuna fishing here. So the Japanese, they have a big appetite for seafood. So a lot of times they don't want to, observe these treaties. They want to eat whale meat or whatever. They want to, harvest whales. They want to eat, just harvest fish from different places, even though it's against the law. So I saw this video of the Japanese fishing boat, and they were throwing, I don't know, tuna or some other fish off their boat because they're about to be raided. And they knew it was illegal to fish there, and they did it anyway. So this book had a picture of it from a British newspaper. And like I said, the British Empire is trying to end slavery in Africa. So this is a slave ship, an Arab slave ship. It looked like a Arab sailing boat called the Dhow. And the Arabs were throwing off their illegal cargo. So the British were coming to raid the ship. So they're throwing off these black men and women off the boat to drown, because they didn't want to be caught with illegal cargo when the British raided their ships. So that's how these Muslim slave traders valued the lives of black men and women. And we should remember it, talk about it, but these are the unpleasant facts of history. There's some dark things in, the Catholic Church has done, and maybe during the religious wars in Europe, there's probably some things the Protestants did we shouldn't be proud of. Some people argue that the Crusades were a just war, fighting against Muslim aggression. Maybe they were, but atrocities occurred during those wars. And, as Christians, I think we should confront the sins of our past and confess them. If they're taken out of context or exaggerated, we should deal with that as well. But we need to confront the sins of the past. And something that people say sometimes, it's like, Muslims are going to have to, it's an internal Muslim problem. Muslims are going to have to reform, and they got to do that, figure that out within themselves. And I don't think that's true. I mean, if we're dying because of their extremism and their need to reform, then it's not an internal Muslim issue anymore, right? It's external. It's affecting me. I'm never going to convert to Islam. So if my life, the life of my fellow Christians, are in danger because they need to confront extremism or antiquated beliefs, then it's my duty to speak out against it. And if racism or slavery is wrong, which I believe it is, it needs to be condemned. And the historical legacy of racism and slavery needs to be condemned as well, even if it's coming from radical Islam. They had this, I got this article, I kept it because it had a picture. It's the 1619 Project, which I don't agree with. The United States of America started in 1607 in Jamestown, but in 1619, the first black slaves were brought somewhere in New England. It's a terrible thing, and like I said, we have to deal with that. But this article, I have to give credit to USA Today. I don't like looking at America. We need to look at America, and we need to see our strengths and our weaknesses, not just look at it in a jaundiced view. But we need to confront the legacy of slavery. I'm not denying that. But at least this magazine, they're talking about slavery in the United States, but it had pictures talking about slavery in the Islamic Empire and the Islamic world, and the 1400 years of Islamic enslavement of the black man. I think Saudi Arabia had legalized black slavery until the 1960s. I think Mauritania had slavery going on until the 1980s. Sudan revived it. ISIS revived it in their countries. They were controlling the Islamic State. ISIS controlled territories, and like I mentioned, you have Saudi Arabians that enslave women here in the United States of America. That was exposed in the news. Like I said, these women escaped and were going to bring charges against the Saudi Arabian prince, and of course our government allowed them to escape back to Saudi Arabia. And in England, like I mentioned, this Saudi Arabian prince murdered his black African slave who he was using as a catamite, a sex slave. So, if these Muslims are going to go to Hyde Park and mock and ridicule our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, God's, the Father's love for the world, our scriptures, the doctrines of the church, and mock what we believe as Christians, then how come we can't open a history book and say, what's going on with this? And in fact, in Hyde Park today, Khatun Tash does that. She opens a book and says, well, explain this to me. And Muslims turn tail and run from her. So good for her. I think we need to examine these facts and hold people accountable for them. And we need to defend our faith against mockery and ridicule that these people do. 8, invasion and conquest. Muslims invaded and occupied Spain for 800 years. They invaded France in the year 732 and they're pushed back. They looted Rome in the hundreds, and actually there's this huge wall around Vatican City, and it's because the Muslims were able to go into Rome and loot it. They actually attacked and looted Rome. So that's why they built a big wall to protect Rome from another Islamic conquest. Number 9 is cultural appropriation. We see this in the Hagia Sophia, which is a very historic cathedral built by Justinian, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, so-called. It's one of the most beautiful church buildings in the world. When the Muslims defeated Constantinople, they were going to destroy the Hagia Sophia, but they changed it to a mosque. And eventually they made the right decision and made it to a museum, and they actually started restoring it. And a lot of the mosaics were covered up. They're uncovering the mosaics and showing the beauty of this building that was covered up by Muslim cultural appropriation. And now the Hagia Sophia is a mosque again. Every major Christian cathedral in the Middle East was converted to a mosque. And the Hagia Sophia, not the Hagia Sophia, but we have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's the exception. However, okay, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the exception. However, Caliph al-Hakam destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and is rebuilt. And beyond that, there's this gigantic mosque overlooking it, this huge minaret. So you're in there worshiping Jesus Christ. And I've seen this many times in churches across the Middle East. You're trying to have a Bible study, or you're worshiping, and they blast out real, it's deafening. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. It's not. It's intimidation, not just have cultural appropriation, but cultural intimidation. So every major Christian cathedral, like you have the Cordova Mosque in Spain, which is a Christian cathedral now. It was originally a Christian cathedral, and the Muslims built a mosque on it, on the cathedral. And when the Muslims left Spain, it was transformed to a cathedral again. But the goal of the Muslims is to convert it to a mosque once again. The Quran itself is cultural appropriation. It's a mishmash of stories plagiarized from the Jewish Midrash, which are retellings of the Old Testament stories in Jewish literature, and the Gnostic Gospels, as well as other legends and tales from the late antiquity that made its way into the Quran. So, cultural appropriation. Lastly, anti-Semitism. Well, Arabs are Semites, yeah, but they're anti-Semitic Semites, and hopefully it's changing. We have this peace agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, and I'm glad to see that. I hope we see more friendly relations. But in Egypt, which has a peace treaty with Israel, they had this dramatization that aired during Ramadan when people were just sitting around watching TV about Jews doing human sacrifice and drinking blood. And you have the hidden hand books such as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion are published and made available. On Arab so-called newscasts, they make all these horrible anti-Semitic comments, and I hope it's changing. But just the level of anti-Semitism you see all around the world, it's common around the Islamic world. It's disturbing. Also, the bonus is, before I move on to about anti-Semitism, there's if you look at the Quran in Islam, there's a huge Jewish influence in it. Like I said, most of the stories in the Quran are Jewish in origin. A lot of their practices, like circumcision and things like that, are strongly not eating pork and things like that are strongly influenced by Judaism. But Muhammad supposedly, according to their accounts, we don't know how historical they are, but Muhammad attacked certain Jewish tribes and just slaughtered, built trenches and decapitated 800 to 1,000 people just because they're Jewish in certain Jewish cities in Arabia. So it's something that Muhammad himself did. The bonus point here is homophobia. I saw this clip from this old show, the The West Wing, this crappy television show with Martin Sheen in it. And he's attacking a woman. It's supposed to be Dr. Laura Schlesinger, who's not even Christian. And I don't think she's really, in real life, I don't think she's particularly homophobic. However, it's like, oh, you believe homosexuality is an abomination. So the President of the United States in this show is attacking her for her homophobic beliefs because she believes that the act of homosexual sex acts are wrong in her moral code. I guess that's, I don't see if you want to believe that way. Why not? It's your own opinion. People have their own moral codes, right? As long as we're not harassing and hurting other people. But you watch these videos, and I don't know if it's in Iran or Saudi Arabia, where they have Sharia law, or if this is ISIS doing it, but there's some video footage from the Muslim world of homosexuals being thrown off the tops of buildings. And it is appalling. But, they're not, you don't hear any, they'll attack Christians from believing that marriage is between conservative Christians believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. That's something that can't be tolerated. But in the East, Muslims throwing men off of buildings because they're homosexual. Apparently, with people on the left in America, that's okay. When Mohammed Morsi, there's this liberal woman in Germany, a friend of a friend or whatever, and Morsi was sending tanks to run over Christians in the street, and she was saying that, oh, Islam's a great religion, it's wonderful. And someone said, what do you think about this? And she got mad that someone had the audacity to show her a picture of what radical Muslims are doing. She is more upset to be shown the reality of life of Christians under an Islamic majority country, just to be exposed to the facts. She was angry about that more than what was happening. She didn't care, she could care less about Coptic Christians being ran over by military vehicles in the street just because they're Christians. It didn't bother her. But being told about it, forced to confront her, ask what she thought about it, that offended her deeply. It's because liberals, they hate Christianity, they want to destroy it. And so look at all these points, and this is just factual here. So Muslims aren't really marginalized people at all. But Islam enjoys a most favored religion status. I think it's because over the centuries, Islam has been very effective against Christianity. And the left, the Marxist radical left, the woke mob, hates Christianity. So I think they're impressed and pleased with how Muslim armies, and just the erasure of Christian culture and civilizations and communities, like in North Africa and the Middle East, the process of which we're seeing today being carried out by ISIS. And that's why Obama didn't care about Syrian Christians being massacred by ISIS. He seemed to be pleased with it. He didn't do anything to stop it. And it took President Trump to do that. So these are just facts, and I think that what's going on is back in the 80s and 90s, China was doing the same thing to democracy activists, to Chinese citizens who wanted freedom. Tanks would come out, they run over in the street, and yet our elected officials, the most powerful people in government, wanted China to have most favored nation status in trade agreements. So the powers that be did not want to pay a fair wage to the American working man and woman. So they wanted to hollow out the American economy and the manufacturing, to get rid of that and send all these jobs to China, where dissidents and Christians are arrested, in purges, and house pastors and of house churches could be forced to, political prisoners can make and manufacture things for American companies, and they can get rich. American people get poor. Let's get rid of the middle class. That's what these Democrats and Republicans wanted to do. That's what happened. And now we got a real problem. China is a hostile foreign power against the United States. That's the way it is. It's just an unfortunate fact. That's the way it is. And they're powerful and wealthy because of our leaders. And our leaders want to marginalize Christianity and promote Islam. And we should have a marketplace of ideas. And I don't think coddling or shielding Islam from criticism or questioning, it doesn't help Muslims. Muslims need to come into the modern world, and maybe they need to do we should all confront the sins of our past and reform And by not allowing these people to question things, they're inhibiting them from being able to reform themselves and modernize. I wouldn't wish radical Islam on anybody. It's not in their own benefit. If you cared about these people, you'd want them to modernize and become more tolerant and open-minded and understanding, right? I've read the Quran. It wouldn't hurt for these people to learn about Christianity and read the Bible. Maybe we'd have more mutual understanding, respect if we did that. But stopping dialogue, debate, and criticism and argumentation and giving these people a most favored religion status that's just totally unwarranted and fair, because Buddhism doesn't have it, Confucianism doesn't have it, Hinduism doesn't have it, Christianity, even Judaism doesn't have it. And yet Muslims, they shield them from any amount of criticism or discussion. You know, like one of the things that this is funny about Pakistan is they won't air certain videos where David Wood, all he does in the video is he puts a text of the Quran on Arabic on one side of the screen and on English on the other, from the Quran, the Hadith, or some other Muslim text. And that's considered hate speech. It's just reading from their sacred text. And it's inevitable these issues will have to be examined and discussed about. So the healthy way to do it is just allow free speech to take place. And if these Muslim radicals can go to Hyde Park and blaspheme and mock and ridicule Christianity, attack the reliability of the Bible, attack the gospel taught by Jesus Christ, and ridicule what we believe, then how come we can't answer their questions at least and just respond to it without being, how come what they do is not considered hate speech? But if we talk about the facts of history, it is. So I think that we need to have a vigorous, open, honest debate, and I don't see any reasons why Muslims can in any way be considered a marginalized people with the power and dominance and financial resources they have, and with their historical legacy of colonialization, of imperialism, discrimination, exploitation, and a legacy that they're not ashamed of, and an examination, a legacy we need to examine, and maybe it would be healthy for them to do some self-examination of it themselves.